We're going to move on to our next speaker, who's going to take us into the life of another character who came west in Montana's history, Martha Edgerton Plassman. And there's another family connection here. So Ben Sanders is also the author of Order Without Law, the Wilbur Fisk Sanders story. And he is a historian, artist, and data analyst who's researched Martha Plassman extensively because she wrote a great deal about growing up with her cousin, Wilbur Fisk Sanders. So welcome, Ben.
Thank you. Thank you. What a wonderful conference this is here in the Heritage. This has really been enjoyable so far, and I learned a lot about genealogy yesterday. So Martha Plassman is what we know her as today, generally. And she was a formidable and resilient Montana woman, and I'm going to tell you how. So Martha Maddie Amelia Edgerton was a lifelong reader and student. She was a mother, a heavy traveler. She was a teacher, a singer, a pianist, a newspaper editor, a writer, a historian, and a social activist. Her goodwill and her indomitable spirit saw her through many, many hard times. Her loyalty to her family, in particular her children, provided for her in her old age when she had literally no other resources. She was born on May 14th, 1850, on her grandparents' farm in Talamage, Ohio, which is about 5 miles east of Akron. The first I learned of Maddie was while researching. I found this letter to my dear little cousin, and it just perplexed me because I couldn't figure out who my dear little cousin was, written from Wilbur Fisk Sanders from the battlefield of Shiloh and Corinth, both. He split it into 2 parts. And it was a letter that kind of continued some philosophical and religious discussions that the two had apparently been carrying on for some time, if you are able to find it and read it there in the Montana Historical Society archives. Maddie talks about early on how she had taught herself to read and knit at the same time. And she loved reading. And she also talked about the fact that on the family farm, there was lots and lots of work to do, but not by her, as long as she kept the baby asleep while rocking the cradle with her toe and reading her favorite book. She says rules were different for little girls back in the 1850s and early 60s. They were not allowed to fly kites, but they could help build them. They weren't allowed to skate alone, but they could trail behind a boy who might favor them by hanging onto his comforter and being whisked across the ice. She said that playing ball and climbing and swimming were also very discouraged for little girls. I'm sure that Maddie really didn't abide, probably. This is the essentially Oregon Trail route, with the exception of a little chunk there from Wyoming to Idaho called the Landers Cutoff, which she writes extensively about, and there's some documents in her file on that. During the outbreak of the Civil War, her father, Sidney Edgerton, was a Republican senator from the state of Ohio. And that in 1863, they migrated to Bannock in the Idaho Territory because Abraham Lincoln had appointed him the Chief Justice of the territory. And so he took his whole family, along with the Sanders family and a few others, to Bannock mining camp. They were originally headed to Lewiston, but that didn't work out. Maddie was about 13. And so the time that she was there, she witnessed a lot of the goings on in that famous vigilante period, and she's observed Henry Plummer every day as he crossed over a walking bridge. And she saw him during his more docile times and during some of his more violent times. Back to Ohio. This is Chrissy Haynes from The Pretenders. She has nothing to do with Maddie. I just thought this would be a cool joke because of the lyric Back to Ohio. The Montana Territory was created in May of 1864, and Sidney was appointed the first territorial governor on June 22nd. In September of 1865, he returned to Washington on official business, according to him, and that he wanted to bring his children back to receive a better education than they could receive in a mining camp. He did not secure authorization from President Andrew Johnson. Lincoln had been assassinated by then. And he, according to Maddie, was forced to resign his governorship. When they got to Ohio, the family encouraged Maddie to attend college at the Oberlin College. She had an uncle that was a professor there. The school had been established and in large part to provide education for freed Black young people after the emancipation. And there, Maddie studied harmony. She studied piano and voice, and she even studied German with hopes of going to the conservatory in Germany, which never transpired. But she was an avid studier, and she was very competitive. And she read to the point of eye strain. And by the time she had to disenroll in school, she just stayed home. And she talks about how they attended that Oberlin had a very large Black population. And they stayed in the dorm rooms. And they ate at the same tables as white students. They went to the same churches as white students. And Maddie says that early on, slaveholders would come to Oberlin to collect their property. And in her words, they never got it. And she says that she imbibed in that sentiment her whole life in terms of tolerating other races, and not in the same terms that we think about tolerance, acceptance. Lieutenant James Bradley also attended Oberlin College, one of the earliest Fort Benton historian, I would imagine. And women were admitted to the school in 1838. In the winter of 1873, Wilbur Sanders came back to Ohio on business. Maddie, of course, is not attending school at this time, but he invites her to come back to Helena with him, and she's about 23 years old. And so she says she gladly accepted the invitation. So this is the third trip she takes across the country. And even though things are improving a little bit, this is still a rough ride, as Bill pointed out. You know, bouncing around in carriages and even on the trains was tough on the body, I would imagine. And so in Helena, Maddie sang at concerts. She visited the home of Malcolm Clark. His murder sparked the Baker Massacre, of course. And that house at that time was owned by James Fergus. In August of 1873, she returned to Ohio again with Harriet Sanders, Hattie Sanders, her three little boys, Jimmy, Willie, and Louie, and her mother, who had come out to, or Hattie's mother, who had come out to see what conditions her daughter were living in, and a boy named Henry Tilden, who was a nephew of Sanders. He had a little run-in with Plummer, if you read about him. Upon returning to Ohio, she found employment at the Ohio Institute for the Blind. She was not given any kind of curriculum. She wasn't shown how to teach blind students how to play the piano or how to teach them to sing and music. She created the entire program herself. And it was quite successful. While she was there, she met a fellow by the name of Herbert Percy Rolfe. He was the principal of the literary department, and he had also graduated from Dartmouth about a year before, and they decided to get married. They met, fell in love, and decided to get married, and they were married on the 8th of August in 1876. During this time, Rolfe applies for a principalship in the Helena school system, and they get married. And their wedding was a very small affair. It's described as a small home affair. And it was officiated over by a fellow by the name of Reverend Carlos Smith, who was her childhood pastor, and he also officiated over Wilbur and Hattie's wedding as well. And she says, thanks to him, I never promised to obey, and I never did. So they left Columbus and returned to Akron for a while. And then Herbert got notice that he had been appointed as the president or the principal of Helena High School, and they headed west. She says, I was prepared for this trip. Herbert was not. Herbert performed his duties as a principal at the Helena High School, and he studied law at night. For the 4 years they lived there, Maddie says 3 major events occurred. The graduation of the first high school class, the introduction of the Bell telephone. Herbert had been appointed as the agent for the West, and the birth of her first 2 daughters, Pauline and Harriet. This is the Helena High School in 1876. In 1880, Herbert was admitted to the bar, and the Rolfes moved to Fort Benton in a record cold November. The government thermometer read 59 degrees below zero. We don't see that very often anymore at all. And of course, they traveled in carriages with her 2 babies. So no heat. It was probably a pretty rough little trip. Herbert passed the bar in 1881 and opened his practice. Maddie returned to Akron again with her 2 daughters and spent a very short time visiting with her family, and says she was happy to return to Montana. This is trip number 6 and 7 for her across the plains. Paris Gibson arrives in the area, has probably been in the area for some time at that point, and he hired Herbert as his surveyor to survey the township of Great Falls. He also hired him as his acting attorney. And by 1883, the city plans were laid out. In the summer of 1884, the Rolfes moved to Great Falls and lived in a shack on their preemption claim. And this was a 4-bedroom on the ground, 1 room up top, vertical board with a tar paper roof building. They were about a half mile from their closest neighbor, which isn't too far, but she had her next baby, Ione, there at that time. The town grew, and Maddie sang at churches and concerts again. She really liked to do that. And she homeschooled her children. And they were doing well enough that Maddie could travel to places like Chicago and New York, and she bought the best school supplies that she could find for her her children and kindergarten material as well. Her girls were the first to ride in town astride a horse. They refused to ride side saddle, and the little boys would sneer at them, and the old ladies would jeer at them, and the little did they care. They were much like their mother. That winter, the shack was way too cold, so they went and stayed in Fort Benton, but returned to Great Falls in 1885 in the spring. That following winter, they stayed in Helena, where she had her twins, Edith and Edgerton. Edgerton's her only son. That spring, they moved back to the shack in Great Falls, and with 6 children now, her sister, Idaho, 2 cousins, Mary and Star Carter from Ohio, Herbert's niece, Lila, and Judith Clark, a daughter of Malcolm Clark's. And together with the couple, she says it was a reasonably large family. That year, the developers of Great Falls felt like things weren't moving along quickly enough, and they moved the paper down from Sun River and published articles promoting Great Falls and its resources. Maddie witnessed the arrival of the Great Northern Railroad in Great Falls in 1887, and she said that it brought a tear to her eye to see the arrival of the train. The Rolfes became wealthier. Herbert bought considerable property and built a business block on Central Avenue. They built a house downtown with a law office attached, but Herbert was so busy he could never spend any time there. So they built a 12-bedroom home on the side of the shack with 2 full baths, which was quite a novelty at the time. June of 1888, Herbert published The Great Falls Leader to replace that old Sun River magazine, promoting agriculture, manufacture, and mining. And I didn't write this note, but she also says that it also promoted for people to develop and occupy reservation land as well. I thought that was an interesting point. The Rolfes thrived for the next 6 years, and until the financial crash of 1894-95, which Maddie describes as having swept away their fortune. Rolfe died of typhoid in 1895 that year at the age of 44. Now, with no experience in business, her future uncertain, Maddie alone kept together 7 children, her youngest, Hester, having been born in Great Falls, and she salvaged her shattered life. She says that there was no one whom she could call on. Wilbur Sanders was dying of cancer. Her only surviving brother and father were too far away back east. And Wilbur suggested to her that she take the editorship of the paper. Maddie says, having never corrected a line of proof, she had some good aid from some of the printers and some of the paper staff. And in her words, I did not entirely fail. When the paper sold 14 months later, the new owners decided to keep her. She was doing that well. While she was there at the paper, she married her business manager, Theodore Plassman. He persuaded her to give up the editorship. And he died a few months later as well. And now Maddie was alone again, and this time unemployed. She says that she was unable to do any kind of menial labor jobs. And I would imagine that after bouncing across the plains so many times, during one trip, her and Wilbur turned over in their carriage on a riverbank, and she took a pretty good beating, but she says she was okay. I would think that, and she describes herself as not being able to do those kind of jobs because she says she had been invalided for several years by then. So she opens a greenhouse, but she says, I gave more plants away than I sold. She tried insurance for a while, which I don't entirely think she failed at, but I don't think it just was her way to, push people to buy something, right? And she sold books and magazines. She tried being a vocal teacher, but she says she started losing her hearing. And so she decides to go into ranching. She knows nothing about ranching or farming. And her cattle die, and a short time later, the ranch house burns to the ground. And she talks about losing her entire silver collection in that fire. Wonderful neighbors came and rebuilt her house for her, a 10-room house, but Maddie was still struggling. So during this time, she goes to a neighboring town to the train station and meets the agent there named James Rector. And he's offers her some literature to read, some political literature to read. And Maddie graciously accepts them and brings them home and realizes they're socialist papers. And she thinks to herself, if Mr. Rector thinks he's going to turn me into a socialist, he's mistaken. But she reads every single word because Maddie's a very avid reader. And she, to her own surprise, decides that these principles answer many of the questions that have troubled her in her life. She joins the local Monarch Local Socialist Party, and she's the only woman, but she says that she never attended any of the meetings there. She says, one of the hardest things that I ever did was to come out openly as a socialist. And knowing how difficult this would be on her children, she says, I had to be true to myself, and I had to be true to them if they were to respect me, knowing that I was right in my beliefs. Her two of her older daughters and her son decide that they're going to move to Missoula and attend the university in Missoula. And so they talk mom into coming with them. And she brings Hester, their youngest baby, and says that she necessarily lived in the plainest manner. She sold the ranch in the Belts outside of Great Falls and every bit of property that she had left from her marriage to Herbert. And she worked and wrote for the Missoulian, writing socialist columns. Like Butte, Missoula had elected a socialist mayor. Both campaigns Maddie had assisted in. And she edited this local Missoula local socialist paper. She got a lot of flack for taking the job and doing it because she was told that only a man could do that job. The children began to scatter, and for the next 2 years, she stayed in Missoula, and she says she lived the simplest life, raising chickens and gardening and perusing the University of Montana's library. And then she says Woodrow Wilson was elected president on the slogan, he'll keep us out of the war. And then he promptly plunged us into the war. She says it was a pitiful sight of a nation gone mad, and her socialist teachings preserved her sanity. She became a member of the Political Equity Club of Great Falls, and was an advocate of women's suffrage. By this time, she's around 63, 5 minutes. Okay. So she says that The movement had lost momentum in 1895, but it picked back up again in 1913 when white women were given the right to vote in 1914. A cause that carried until 1920 when women across the country gained the right to vote. White women. Black women didn't receive the right to vote until 1965. World War II broke out. Montana was, in her terms, a hive of spies. Neighbors would spy on each other, and they reported them to an agency in Butte. And she made no secret about her sentiments, and she was able to share her feelings about the war. And one of her friends told her that it is a miracle you aren't in jail. It's your sex and age and connections that protect you. Men who feared to look on the other side of the shield came to me, she says, to learn what was going on and to balance her opinion against their own. After the war, she went and lived among her children in different locations. She says, like many old women, I had become a wanderer. She still wrote verse and historical stories, wrote an account of her crossing of the plains, and submitted it to a local syndicate that focused on the history of the Northwest, in particular Montana. And it was accepted, and she worked for that paper for 6 years, but it doesn't ever appear to have been published. Although I believe there's about 5 files in her folder that cover that story pretty comprehensively. She authored historical articles for the Great Falls Tribune and the Montana News Association based on her own experiences, memories, and formal research. I close with the closing of Maddie's life as written by her. It remains for me to be given a name near the close of my life as one was bestowed on me at its beginning. For the sun is now setting on the nearly 83 years herein chronicled. I cannot predict when it will drop below the horizon and be plunged in darkness. As I write, our country is in the midst of a financial depression such as it has never hitherto experienced. In the land of abundance, thousands are on the verge of starvation. Will they meekly succumb? That is the vital question of the day. In my long life, I have witnessed many crises in the body politique, but none approaching this insignificance. The entire civilized world is seething with revolt, and it is not a pleasant future for an old woman who loves humanity to contemplate. Therefore, it is well for me if the darkness comes speedily. I'm tired, so tired, and fain would sleep. Yet my life so far has been too interesting to voluntarily be relinquished, and I am curious to learn what its brief future has to offer. Tired or not, I must see it through. Her name was then Martha Rolfe Plassman, and she died on September 25th, 1936, and is interred in Great Falls, and she died at the age of 86. She was truly a formidable and resilient Montana woman.